When one mind becomes many. The case studies behind dissociative identity. What if the person sitting across from you could suddenly speak with a different voice, remember a different life, and insist on a different name? For more than a century, cases of multiple personalities have fascinated doctors, writers, courts, and the public. Today, the diagnosis is usually called Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID, but the mystery is older than the name. It is not simply about acting differently in different situations. Many reported cases involve memory gaps, handwriting changes, different ages, different fears, different skills, and even different accounts of what happened to the body. The central question is uncomfortable. Is identity one solid thing? Or is it something the mind assembles from memory, continuity, and survival? To understand why this topic became so famous, we have to look at the cases that made people believe the self could split. That is why the subject keeps returning in books, films, crime discussions, and psychology debates. It touches the fear that the self we trust may be less seamless than it feels. The most famous criminal case is Billy Milligan. In the late 1970s, Milligan was charged in Ohio after a series of serious crimes, including assaults connected to Ohio State University. During evaluation, clinicians reported that he appeared to have many distinct identity states, often described as 24 personalities. Some were said to speak with different accents, hold different memories, or take control for different purposes. Names like Arthur, Reagan, Alan, Tommy, David, and Adelana became part of the public story. The case shocked people because it moved the question of identity from the clinic into the courtroom. If one identity commits a crime and another has no memory of it, who is responsible? Milligan was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent for psychiatric treatment. The case remains controversial, but it forced the public to confront a terrifying legal puzzle. Can a single body contain divided accountability? Even people who doubt parts of the Milligan story usually recognize why it became famous. It exposed a gap between how law imagines a person and how fractured consciousness may actually feel. Another case that shaped public imagination was Sybil, the name used for Shirley Mason. Her story became famous through a best-selling book and later screen adaptations, which described a woman with 16 personalities connected to severe childhood trauma. For many viewers, Sybil became the image of multiple personality disorder, a damaged person whose mind divided to hold memories too painful for oneself to carry. But the case is also one of the most debated in the history of psychology. Some later writers and researchers question the role of therapy, suggestion, medication, and the media machine around the story. That controversy matters. It does not mean trauma is fake, and it does not mean dissociation is fake. It means famous cases can become mirrors of their time. They show real suffering, but also the danger of turning suffering into a story the public wants to consume. The Sybil controversy also teaches a second lesson. The audience often wants certainty, but mental health history is full of cases where pain, interpretation, treatment, and storytelling become tangled together. Before Sybil, there was Costner Sizemore, whose story inspired The Three Faces of Eve. She was reported to have 3 major identity states, often described as Eve White, Eve Black, and Jane. One appeared anxious and restrained, another more impulsive and bold, and another more stable. What made the case powerful was not simply the number of identities, but the contrast between them. It suggested that one person could contain different emotional worlds, each with its own access to memory and behavior. Sizemore later said her experience was far more complex than the famous movie suggested, with many more parts over time. That is a pattern in these stories. The simplified public version becomes iconic, while the real person behind it is messier, longer, and more human. A life cannot be reduced to a dramatic diagnosis scene. Sizemore's later reflections are important because they return ownership of the story to the person who lived it, instead of leaving it in the hands of doctors, filmmakers, or curious strangers. One of the older cases often discussed in the history of dissociation is Louis Vivet, a French patient from the 19th century. Reports described dramatic changes in memory, personality, and even physical symptoms after trauma and illness. In some states, he was said to remember certain periods of life while forgetting others. In another, he behaved differently and seemed to occupy a different version of himself. The details are filtered through old medical language, and we should be careful about treating every historical report as modern proof. But Vivet matters because he shows that the idea did not begin with movies or internet fascination. Long before modern psychology had today's categories, doctors were already encountering people whose memories and identities did not connect in ordinary ways. The mystery was there before the label was stable. Historical cases like Vivet also remind us that diagnosis changes over time. What one century calls hysteria, another may call dissociation, trauma response, conversion symptoms, or something else entirely.
So, what connects these cases? The common thread is dissociation, the mind separating parts of experience that would normally be integrated. In ordinary life, identity feels continuous because memory stitches yesterday to today. You may act differently at work, with family, or under stress, but you still feel like one person because the bridges remain intact. In severe dissociation, those bridges can weaken or break. A person may lose time, find evidence of actions they do not remember, feel unfamiliar with their own body, or experience inner parts with different roles. Some parts may protect, some may hold fear, some may handle daily life. Clinicians often connect this pattern to early, repeated trauma, especially when escape was impossible. The mind may divide, not because it is theatrical, but because division once helped survival. This is where the topic becomes less supernatural and more intimate. The mind is not splitting for spectacle. It is trying to organize unbearable experience into compartments that can be survived.
The topic is controversial because it sits at the intersection of trauma, memory, therapy, culture, and suggestion. Some researchers argue DID is under-recognized, and that skepticism leaves vulnerable people without care. Others worry that certain therapeutic methods, media stories, or expectations can shape how symptoms appear. Both concerns are important. Human memory is not a video recording. It is reconstructive, emotional, and influenced by context. At the same time, people with severe dissociation can experience real distress, real amnesia, and real disruption. The responsible question is not, how can we make this as shocking as possible? The responsible question is, what is happening to this person? What helped them survive, and what helps them become safer now? Curiosity must be paired with humility, because the mind is easiest to misunderstand when we want a dramatic answer. A good documentary approach should therefore hold two ideas at once: skepticism towards simplified legends, and compassion toward people whose lives are genuinely disrupted by dissociation. These case studies leave us with a deeper question than whether one famous story was perfectly accurate. They ask what a self really is. Is it a name, a body, a memory chain, a voice in the head, or the ability to say, all of this happened to me? Billy Milligan turned identity into a legal question. Sybil turned it into a cultural phenomenon. Costner Sizemore showed how a real life can be flattened by a famous adaptation. Louis Vivet reminds us that the mystery existed before modern labels. Today, DID is best approached not as horror, but as a human puzzle, built from pain, memory, and survival. Maybe the most unsettling idea is not that one mind can become many. It is that every self is already a fragile construction, and most of us only notice the stitching when it begins to tear. The cases are famous because they sound impossible, but the lasting question is painfully human. What happens when remembering everything as one person would be too much to endure?